Hey everyone, it's Paula MacLean again, and we are continuing on with the module on risk management and liability. This lesson relates to those three fiduciary duties. Now, fiduciary is a hard word to say, is even harder to spell, but when you kind of wrap your head around what fiduciary means, it really means to be in a position of trust. So the board and senior management are in positions of trust inside the organization, so we have certain responsibilities around this. So if you're somebody's guardian, if you have power of attorney over someone, if you're the financial administrator for someone with a disability, if you have responsibilities for a minor child, you are in a position of trust, so you have certain fiduciary responsibilities that fall to you. Now, what does this mean? It means that we have to take care of the people, the property, the facilities, and the money of the organization, and we have to always be acting in the best interest of those things, to safeguard them, to protect them. The word we often talk about, and I love this word, it's called stewardship. And so if you think about being an effective steward, you think about I'm providing guidance and leadership and support to the organization and in the best interest of the organization. So that means we're putting the interests of the organization ahead of our own personal or professional potential gain. And what we don't want to do is ever muddy that waters, and we have a whole module on conflict of interest and code of conduct that will help further clarify that whole area of potential gain and the potential for kind of muddying the waters by personal interest getting in the way. So gain does not have to be financial, although the one that hits the scary headlines is often financial. It's when people in positions of trust abuse that position of trust and steal money for some reason. It can also be in the area of reputation, relationships, influence, social standing, any of a number of things that are not financially related, even in the immediate and then also upstream later on in the future. So let's talk about the first duty. This one's called the duty of care or the duty of diligence. You will see both. They essentially mean the same thing. So directors are not required to be experts, but the law requires that directors use the level of expertise that is reasonable for a person who is looking, for example, at a financial statement. Now, so I don't have to have an accounting background, and I'm looking at a financial statement, and I see in that financial statement all of a sudden something that pops up that says $163,000 additional liability to Toronto Dominion or to Chase Bank. And I think a reasonable person would ask a question about that. Even if you don't have a finance background and you think, did I miss that in the previous month's statement? Did I not read that carefully? So I'm going to say, I don't know, I might have missed that, but what's this $163,000 increase in liability that I see on our balance sheet? Someone's going to say, well, that's this. So we have a responsibility, even if we're not finance people, to ask the questions that are fairly obvious that we would ask. It's like, think about it as looking at your own statement from your checking account and seeing something that's a withdrawal for $400 that you don't think you made, and you're not sure where that went to, and if it's a bank code, then you don't really know where the withdrawal was, and you can't remember writing a check. So you're going to ask that question. So that's the standard we have. Now, up the standard to the third point on this slide, and that is that every single person who has specialized training has a responsibility to ask the questions that relate to their area of specialty. So this means for finance people, we rely on them as non-financial board members. We rely on them to ask higher level questions of the finance person, of the executive director, CEO. If someone has a background in nursing care, for example, and your organization serves people who have palliative care needs, that nurse might ask questions around risk management that say, what are our protocols around this, that, or the other thing, okay? Now, this is operational, but it's still okay to ask, and it's okay to be transparent. And if you go zipping back about 3 modules ago, I remind you that most of the time, operationally, we share our policies with the board. So this is a question that's a governance question because it's a risk mitigation question, not because the board member wants to get involved in operations. So we want that board member to use their expertise. I have HR and governance expertise. If I'm on a board, I bring that expertise to the table, and I will be asking questions around this. Example, when I was on the board of the YWCA many years ago, I asked a question about what is our policy when we dismiss an employee, how many people do we have in the room, and do we always have legal counsel? Right? This was a risk mitigation question. Why? Because we get sued for wrongful dismissal more than anything else, and way more than slip falls and, you know, facility breakdowns and equipment problems and etc. It is HR related that we get sued for. So this practice was a very important thing to have in place. By the way, you should always have two people, including, in addition to the employee, one taking minutes, the other doing the actual dismissal words. And it is absolutely critical for all but probationary employees. By the way, those of you from the US that are watching this, you don't have probably probationary employees. Most states are what are called at will, so the employee can be dismissed without cause. But we still need legal counsel to make sure that we have not violated any provincial, state, or federal statutes around the dismissals. So I'm an HR person. I'm going to ask those questions around risk mitigation when we have that question to make sure our policies are sound. This is another one of those where the probability is high, the impact is high, and the strategies to mitigate are a piece of cake. They're so easy. They're not difficult to change at all, and we can probably reduce our exposure to liability around HR practices by 90 or 100% simply by putting 2 or 3 practices in place that prevent us from doing this wrong. So directors have to keep themselves informed and ask pertinent questions of other directors and of senior management. So this says I have to be awake. I do not want to be doing my preparation in the car, reading my minutes from last meeting, reading my financials, reading the agenda, reading the backup material in my board package, and I'm sitting there in the car eating my sandwich and trying to get caught up on stuff that I didn't have time to do during my working day. Not good enough. If you don't have time to be on the board, get off the board. If you have time to be on the board, then be prepared and ask good questions and be ready for the conversation. This is one of the things that courts look at in terms of the risk management and liability exposure is this board doing the best job possible to mitigate risk by being aware, be participating, being prepared, asking good questions. So we want to make sure that the organization is properly managed and its assets are protected. And I'll go back for the 500th time and say trust but verify. Do your proper evaluation, set up proper procedures for evaluating management, doing employee satisfaction surveys, etc. And so important little quote here is that directors on the board may delegate to the executive director or CEO, but they must not abdicate, which means they can't just leave it to them and foolishly trust. So we really want to make sure that the trust but verify is applied in the circumstance of the duty of care. Just think careful, right? Diligence, making sure that we are careful to be able to do the things that are required of us. Okay, the second fiduciary duty is the duty of loyalty. So the board and its members have to put the interests of the organization as a whole ahead of all other interests, right? So this is essentially the trust piece, and this is what fiduciary really does mean. And members must disclose before a decision or before a conversation is held, both personal and professional business interess. And so it's really helpful to look for the potential for conflict of interest in advance. I know some boards who actually require their board members to say, here are my following affiliations, connections, professionally or personally. And the intention behind that is to let the board and executive director be able to scan these sheets to make sure that when an issue becomes a conversation at a board level, that the potential for conflict of interest is something that's front and center. And then the final piece here is that members have to avoid conflict of interest and declare to the board any potential or actual conflict of interest, and that's for themselves as well as for any other member of the board that they may be aware of. Now, this can be done tactfully. They can say, yeah, I can say, you know what? I was a staff member in that organization for the last 4 years, and I'm just really aware that there's probably, I have insider knowledge and information, I probably should declare that I have a conflict. Then that lets the board have a conversation about what that could be. And again, we've got a whole module on this, so don't worry about the details right now. So what we're doing here is we're making sure that we create a sense of openness with our self-dealing so that we are informing the board in advance that we have a conflict. Now, I might be aware of someone else on the board or of a senior manager in the organization who also has a potential conflict. And it's my job, this is the big brother and big sister is watching, it is my job to also say, you know, I don't mean to cause a ripple here, but I'm aware that this organization that we're about to contract with for $100,000 used to be a partner organization with, you know, Bob or Mary's, you know, company. So whatever that is, if we're aware of it, is our responsibility to identify it and then leave it to the board. You don't have to make judgments. You don't have to make strong statements. Just leave it to the board to have a conversation and sort out, is this conflict perceived but not real, perceived and very real, and then we have procedures to be able to deal with that. The final fiduciary duty is the duty of obedience, and this is exactly what it sounds like. The board has to comply with all the laws and regulations pertaining to its incorporation and operation, so any funder rules, any rules that come from the various governments that regulate you. The board also must monitor management and compliance with the requirements of funders, licensing bodies, accrediting organizations regarding the quality of service, program outcomes, accounting practices, and all of those things must be met by management. So the board has stewardship oversight of those things. And then finally, the board has to abide by its own governance policies. The example I gave you a little bit earlier of just ignoring the grievance letter that came to the board is a great example of duty obedience that failed on the part of this board. Unfortunately, we were able to sort it out. All right, the next one is that directors may delegate certain duties to management and committees to officers of the board. Officers of the board are your executive members, the chair, the vice chair, the secretary, the treasurer, and those committees can do work on behalf of the board, but the board still must maintain oversight, supervision, and accountability back from those individuals or committees. So the committee of the board does not have the authority of the board. The committee has to come back to the board with recommendations, and the board makes the decisions. So that helps keep things clean in terms of your obedience to your own rules. And the final one in this section is that directors must attend meetings. They have to review materials in advance, everything that's sent to you in your board package, and then they need to participate actively in the decision making, the conversation, the asking of questions. This is one of the things we call due diligence, right? We have to do our whole job. So that's the end of this module. And on the next slide, we have your turn learning assignments. So I want you to review each of those 3 fiduciary duties. It's great if you can have a group discussion about this. If you're watching the video individually, then that's perfectly fine. I want you to identify the strengths of your organization and your good practices that are actually meeting the requirements of those 3 areas. And then finally, I want you to ask the question, where could we improve? Where should we up our game? Where could we be a little bit better? Where do we need to refine or tweak our practices? And do not worry about it. You are in good company if you say, we're not doing any of these, or we're not very aware of them, or we're kind of taking our baby steps in terms of our awareness. That's fine. That's what these videos are all about, is to get you started. And if you can just refine and tweak, then you're so much the better. But don't worry about it. Make sure that you're just getting yourself on the path and setting yourself off in the right direction. All right, let's join me in the next module.